person you can turn to, and if they don't know, they know who to go to. They've got some access to like the Illinois Association of Realtors legal hotline or something else they can turn to. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get back to our scintillating lecture here. So we're still talking about transfer taxes. Now we're talking about municipal transfer taxes. The text sometimes uses the term local, and I hesitate to think kind of local taxes because local could be county only if you're not within the municipality. So what's important to understand, or one thing that's important to understand about this, is that not every municipality has a transfer tax. So you need to figure out, whether you do or don't have one. So here's how it's going to work. If a municipality has a population of 25,000 or more, under the Illinois Constitution, they're subject to home rule, which means they have the right to enact their own taxing laws. So a municipality with a population of 25,000 or more probably will have a municipal transfer tax simply because they can. Doesn't mean they will, but they can. I think it goes back 10 to 15 years. We do these biennial, what they call them, or decennial, whatever it is, every 10-year census, right? It's part of the Constitution, basically, to do this kind of thing. Well, that also serves the purpose for apportionment and other kinds of things for taxes, etc. So when Oswego and Batavia were both growing very rapidly, they both wanted to pass their own municipal transfer tax ordinance, but they needed to hit the populations of 25,000, which before they had not. So both of them commissioned censuses between the censuses so they could prove they had 25,000 people. One did, and one found out there were a couple hundred people short. And these extra censuses sometimes cost $100 grand or more. So it's not a thing you do lightly, and one of them spent all that taxpayer money and proved, in fact, that they didn't have the population that they thought they did. So again, you'll need to find this out. Because it's done at a municipal level, every municipality by municipal ordinance can have a different tax rate and rule of who pays, etc. So knowing that, again, you need to kind of figure out where is this transaction and how's it going to work. So in some cases, the seller pays transfer taxes, municipal transfer tax, and in some cases, it's the buyer, and in some cases, it's both. Now, I did skip this part. I seem to always do this for some reason. With the state and county tax, by law, that is always paid by the seller. And that's a good test question item as well. In practice, the parties can switch that. The buyer could take on that liability. It rarely happens, but it is a possibility. But here, by law, also, it's not a state law anymore, it's municipal law. It's going to vary by municipality as to who pays it and as to, what it takes to do that. Also, there are requirements to actually get the transfer tax stamps. Now, let me just look at something here so I don't skip. All right. So the idea is that in order to make sure that the tax has been paid, the title insurance company requires that the transfer tax stamp be made available to them at the closing. They do not make this requirement with the state and the county because the title insurance company who's handling the closing simply withholds that amount of money from the seller's proceeds, and sometime within a few days after the closing, when they take the deed to record it, they also take the money to the county treasurer's office and pay the transfer tax stamp for both the state and the federal, and then that transfer tax stamp is put on the deed before it's recorded. You cannot record the deed without all of the required transfer tax stamps. So because of the variation in the municipal transfer taxes, this transfer tax stamp must be brought to the closing by either the buyer or the seller, whoever it is that has to pay for it. So that is important to understand, well, what are all the things that have to be done before the municipality will even release the stamp? It varies significantly. So as Ken and I were talking, what business are most municipalities in? What do they sell you on a regular basis? They bill you monthly, quarterly? They sell you water in most cases.
Some transferred?
Yeah, they might. Again, depends upon where you are, electricity as well. You're not gonna be able to get your municipal transfer tax stamp unless all of those bills to the city are paid currently right before closing. So let's take a city like Aurora. The seller, to get the municipal transfer tax stamp, is gonna have to make sure that they have paid their water bill and the corresponding Fox Metro bill as well. And in order to do that, you need to schedule a final meter reading. And in order to do that, you better do it a couple of weeks in advance, because if you call up the city 2 days before the closing, or at 10 a.m. on a day of a 2 o'clock closing, it doesn't matter how good you are at crying and screaming and pitching a fit, they ain't coming out and doing that. Your closing is gonna get delayed. So you need to schedule that in advance. And the city of Aurora actually does a full title search on their own, basically, because they want to make sure that there's no other city liens, like for board up or cleanup or maintenance or anything else against the property. So they need a couple of weeks' notice before the closing. So any municipality that has those kinds of hoops that have to be jumped through, you can't just show up the day of the closing and say, I got the money here, I need to write a check for the transfer tax stamp. They won't issue it without all these other things having been done in advance. Displays is one, and then there's another one I can't remember. If you have not paid your vehicle sticker tax, you can't get a transfer tax stamp. So you need to know what all those things are in advance. Again, this varies by municipality. This is another reason why I say it helps if you specialize. If you only close transactions in an area with 2 or 3 towns, Aurora, Montgomery, Sugar Grove, you'll know which ones have transfer taxes and what they are and who pays them. If you're closing a transaction for the first time in a particular municipality, who knows? Again, it's going to vary. And all it takes is one city council meeting and one proposal and one set of motions and one positive vote, and there's a change to the municipal transfer tax ordinance for that municipality. That's all it takes. So it's the kind of thing that can change without you noticing. So even if you closed a deal there last year, it may not be the same. So you need to inquire. So when you're closing your first few transactions, as soon as that contract is formulated, what's one of the things you're going to do? Look into the municipal transfer tax. If it's a small place like Sugar Grove, they're in there. But if it's a big place like Aurora, yeah, or Elgin, or Joliet, or Naperville, or Glen Ellen, or now probably Batavia and Oswego and a lot of other places where the population is at 25,000. Most communities in Illinois do not have municipal transfer taxes, but most municipalities that can do. So as the towns are larger, they tend to. So around Chicago, you tend to have them. So where are you going to find out? Who are you going to contact?
The village?
Yeah, exactly. Go to their website, just pick up the phone and call them. Call the main number and say, I have a question about if there's a municipal transfer tax. They will figure out exactly where to route that call. You're not the only one calling and asking about it. You can get that information sometimes from a title company or from a realtor association. I wouldn't trust that that's up to date. Get it straight from the municipality themselves.
I missed the first, few
Yeah.
things that you touched on.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm clear about this. You need, normally it's populations of 25,000 or more that's going to have this municipality transfer tax.
Right, because without that, if you don't have a population that big, so let's say Sugar Grove, which has what, 10,000 people,
Right.
it would take a state law. The state General Assembly would have to authorize them to have a transfer tax. So that's what that's all about. And that home rule covers a lot of things, but that's what that does for us here in this particular case. Other questions about any of this before we look at it? We still have a little bit more to go before I change slides. Okay, this is on your final. This is not in the textbook. This is the only thing I'm doing this to you on. But I see a lot of agents who, again, fail to grasp this idea. So this goes back to what I just said. There are 3 questions you must ask about municipal transfer taxes. You already know them about the state and the county. So the first question, is there a transfer tax? And as I've hinted, Aurora, the answer is yes, and Sugar Grove, the answer is no. So that's the first question. Is there a municipal transfer tax? Assuming that's yes, then the next question is, what's the rate? So assuming I still have current information in my brain, my experience is that Aurora, Glen Ellen, Elgin, Joliet, Naperville all have the exact same transfer tax rate. And as far as I know, it's the lowest municipal transfer tax rate that we have anywhere. $3 per thousand. That's twice as much as the combined state and county. Again, don't take that for my word. A year from now, we'll close the transaction, check with them. But I've never seen a municipal transfer tax rate any lower than that. So the state and the county amount is pretty low. Municipalities really count on this revenue. In Glen Ellen, for example, where there's a lot of teardowns, a lot of selling of old bungalows, and then the big teardowns or whatever, building the much bigger houses, they count on that transfer tax revenue to do things like repave the city streets. And there were years when they were a few years ahead of schedule on updating the water mains and city streets or whatever. Very well run. And when the real estate market shut down in '08, that really hurt some of the smaller villages. They need that revenue. Municipality alone, the highest rates that I've seen are Berwyn and Cicero. And now there might be others that join them. $10 per thousand, or a full whopping 1% of the transaction. That's getting up into grocery sales tax level. Only you don't go to Jewel and buy $300,000 worth of groceries in one fell swoop where you worry about the tax you're paying. Now, the transfer tax in Chicago is actually higher. But Chicago has been imposed upon by the state, so Chicago's transfer tax for itself is $7.50, or 3/4%. And then there's an additional, I think it's an additional $3 or $3.50 that the state imposed, all of which goes to fund CPA. Remember, maybe 5 years ago, CPA was short of money. The state was looking for an emergency source of funding, so they put a higher transfer tax on property in Chicago. I don't think it's Cook County. I think it's just Chicago. The CTA is not the RTA, right? It's just the Chicago Transit Authority. But that was state imposed, so again, it's higher. I don't consider it their fault, I guess. So, first question, is there a transfer tax on this transaction? Second, if yes, then what is the rate? And third, who pays? And we know for the state and the county, the answer for that one is always the seller. But municipality, it's that weird combination, buyer, seller, or both.
You say buyer, seller, or both?
Yep, buyer or seller or both. And there are some interesting combinations. So in places like Aurora and Glen Ellen and Joliet and Elgin, the transfer tax is, municipal transfer taxes are paid by the seller. So the seller in Aurora is going to pay that 50 cents and 25 cents per 500 for the state and the county. Then they're going to pay $3 per thousand. So they're really going to pay almost 0.5%. They're going to pay basically 0.45% for transfer taxes. So instead of $150 on a $100,000 sale, you have $150 plus 300 more. You have $450. It's 3 times as much in Aurora when you factor in the municipality as well as state and county. Cities like Naperville and Wheaton, it's the buyer. So, if your desire is to get out of Aurora and move into Naperville, what are you going to end up doing? You'll pay the transfer tax twice. You'll pay it as a seller in Aurora, and then again as a buyer in Naperville, neighboring communities. The same thing is true with Glen Ellen and Wheaton. You sell in Glen Ellen and you buy in Wheaton, you pay municipal transfer tax twice. It's the kind of thing your clients probably ought to know. And who's going to tell them? You should. So Naperville homes are a little more expensive than the average. The average statewide, area-wide, whatever, might be, 180,000 or something. Naperville, the average might be 300,000. I don't know. So if 3% per thousand, you know, if somebody's buying a $500,000 house in Naperville, that's $1,500 bucks, or $3 per thousand, excuse me, 0.3%. That's $3,000 or $1,500, excuse me. That's serious change. More than one buyer has been annoyed at their agent because they didn't know they had to pay that kind of money to buy into the city. And I think Naperville passed that ordinance that way because many years ago when they were going to do it the opposite and have the seller pay, a very vocal crowd kind of convinced the city council, you don't want to do that. So the city council did an about face and said, well then how about instead of charging you nice folks when you transfer out, we'll charge the fools who come to replace you. Passed, no problem. Because Naperville has historically been a high corporate turnover kind of town. You went there to work for, you know, they're not much of it anymore, but AT&T or Lucent or somebody like that, and they would be there for 2 or 3 years, then you get transferred back to New Jersey or transferred out to California or whatever. So people who lived there knew they were going to get transferred pretty soon, so they didn't want to pay that kind of transfer tax. So easier to put off on the buyer. Other anomalies here in Bolingbrook, it's split. I think the buyer and the seller each pay an equal amount. Don't remember what the rate is. I told you about Chicago already, where it's $750 for the buyers, and then there's an amount separate for the sellers that actually funds the CPA. They're not the same amounts. And then Elmhurst has an interesting thing. I think their rate is like $3 or $3.50 per thousand when you sell. But if you buy another house in Elmhurst within 9 months, they rebate what you paid as a seller. So it's all different. So again, the whole point of this is, and this is the question you're going to get asked, you need to know what these 3 critical questions are. What are they? You know, is there a transfer tax? If yes, how much? If once I know that, who pays? Because you need to do a net sheet for your seller, or you need to tell a buyer how much cash they're going to have to bring to closing, and you can't do either of those if you don't know what the transfer taxes are. It's not insignificant dollars. This is not the 75 cents, whoops, I used the wrong, you know, I forgot to round up my $500. This is the, oh, it's now 3 times what I thought. Or in the case of Berwyn and Cicero, it's now 6 or 7 times what I thought it was going to be.
So are we gonna need to know for your test who pays the taxes in the cities that are up there?
You need to know that those questions exist, that's it. What the rates are, no, I would not do that to you, because that you need to get in the habit of checking when you're doing transactions. I don't care if you know any rates, I just want you to know that it's an issue, and those 3 questions will direct you to solve that problem with every transaction. Oh, I forgot, when we were talking back here about other obligations, a few municipalities require inspections today. Can't sell your house in West Chicago or Bedford Park or a few other places if the city itself has not inspected your property. Can't sell your house in Glen Ellen if the city hasn't inspected your sump pump discharge. And that inspection is only good for like 90 days or 6 months or something. So you can't have it inspected when you first list, because if it takes too long to close, you can't get the transfer tax stamp because your inspection will have expired. Again, you need to know what all those requirements are when you're going to list the properties or when you're working with buyers in a particular area. Again, if you specialize, it's less likely these things fall through the cracks. Questions about any of this at all? All right, as I mentioned, you fill out, you don't, but at the closing, somebody fills out a P-tax form, buyer, seller, their attorneys, the closer, you know, whatever. Somebody fills out this form. Only one party has to sign it, as I recall. It's known as a green sheet, and it gets sent off to the township assessor and to the county treasurer, so that information, they know what the transaction sold for, and they have that for future tax determination. Just like we talked about in Chapter 10 with real estate tax exemptions, there are transfer tax exemptions. If an owner of property, either as a buyer or a seller, will be exempt from real estate taxes, they are also exempt from the transfer tax. State, county, municipal. You don't see this very often. Attorneys don't even know this in some cases, so I'm just telling you by experience, this is what happens. So if you are representing a church that is selling their church and they are not paying property taxes, they will not pay any transfer tax. If you're representing a church that is a nonprofit as a buyer and you're pretty sure they're going to get a tax exemption, they should also get a transfer tax exemption as a nonprofit as well. Same rules. And I think I mentioned the transfer tax enforcement. The simple way that that transfer tax is enforced is by way of those stamps, right? That's the whole idea of the stamps themselves. Without the stamp, you can't get it recorded, so that's why the title company requires you to bring that stamp itself to closing to prove that it's been paid for. And it gets a little bit awkward when the buyer has to pay for the stamp and the seller hasn't paid all their bills. Because if you're the seller and you walk into the municipality to get your transfer tax stamp, and you didn't know that there was a $200 lien on your property because, you know, you damaged a garbage can that they had to replace or some silly thing, as a seller, you can just sort of suck it up and write the bigger check. But now as the buyer, you're showing up to pay for your buyer transfer tax stamps, and the seller has some outstanding debt. That's a little bit of a problem. Sometimes that will result in a telephone call to you as the listing agent to say, what do you want to do here? And it's not at all uncommon then. You contact your seller and tell them, here's what has to happen. The buyer's going to write the check, and you're going to reimburse the buyer at closing out of their proceeds. Otherwise, get in your car and drive to City Hall right now and pay off this bill that you owe. Final utility bills, whatever. Or the money can be held in escrow, but somehow it has to be dealt with. Again, it's easy if it's the seller getting the transfer tax stamp. It's a little bit awkward when the buyer is getting it and it's the seller's debts. Yes, Georgie.
All right, right, with all this running that needs to be done, is this the job of the agent, real estate agent?
Maybe. If you have the time and your clients are busy and you have their money to do it with, by all means. Do not ever go to a municipality and write a check for the transfer tax stamp, assuming that you'll get reimbursed at closing. You're not a party to the transaction, and you may not be able to get that happen. I know agents who do that kind of thing, or have done it in the past. If something happens and you don't get reimbursed, you might be out that money. But you should put it back on the clients, but you have to let them know. You have to inform them, this is something you're going to have to do. I try and avoid 8 a.m. closings because there's no time to go get the transfer tax stamps ahead of time. Because people need a little time, and then if a problem arises, and the more complicated the transaction is, the more likely there's some kind of unpaid bill. If you're selling an apartment building, for example, you've got 6, 8, 10, 12, 24 meters, whatever, there's a real good chance there's something there that hasn't been paid, or there's something there that got missed, or there's some inspection for investment property that the seller wasn't aware of that they had to undertake. So yeah, you should put all that back on them, but know what it is and lay that out there for them as their responsibility. Though it may necessitate some running of yours ahead of time to figure all that stuff out.
I'm just wondering, because we've bought a lot of houses through the years, and I don't ever remember
Doing that yourself?
doing anything for the tax stamp.
Yeah, well, you may not have had to. Again, if it's a seller's deal, it's not at all uncommon for an agent to just get a check from the seller and go and pick it up. Because you know what the dollar amount is, that should be easy. But typically, I would put that back on the client to whatever degree I could. If you have clients that are really busy, just get a check from them and you can go do it. I just think you don't want to use your money first, although theoretically you should get reimbursed within hours. All right, any other questions at all about transfer taxes or transfer tax stamps? All right, so we talked about prescriptive easement back in chapter 7. That crazy ass idea that somebody can use your property for 20 years and they get the right to use it in perpetuity after that. So here it is kind of in a much more serious way. And this is what we were talking about, several of us, with that fence over the property line. Adverse possession is the same idea, the same exact criteria of open, notorious, continuous, hostile, and adverse use for a continuous, one period of time. But here, instead of somebody earning an easement, they actually gain title to that portion or all of the land if it's the entire piece. Again, 20 years. As I point out here, this is not a forced sale. No money changes hands. So the most recent case here in this area is Knopf v. Ryan. This is the case number, in Kendall County in 2003 on Woolley Road in Oswego. I know that very well because my brother and his wife and 2 sons lived on Woolley Road for 20 years, right down the road from them. Woolley Road is where the newer fire station is, for example. All right, so in Knopf versus Ryan, what ended up happening is that you had 2 neighbors live side by side for 35 years. So the 20-year time frame was never in question. It was never an issue. There were only 2 issues raised in the case. What happened was that one of the parties, and I can never remember who was who, one of the parties built a fence, and as it turned out, that fence was several feet off the line. They built it too far inside their own property line. So they left a strip of property as much as 8 feet wide, and because these are farmettes, it was like 400 feet deep, resulting in like, 4,000 square feet of property or some crazy thing. It was not an insignificant amount of land. So the neighbor who was now, who lived next door, went ahead and mowed that, went ahead and planted, decorated, put, trees on it and everything, used it fully for 35 years, then sold the property. And when the surveyor came out and surveyed based upon the last plat of survey, their stakes showed the buyers that they were getting something smaller than they thought. They said to their attorney at the closing, we thought we were getting to the fence line. So the attorney prepared 2 deeds. One from the, from the seller for the property they owned, clearly, and the other for that strip that they knew would be in dispute based upon the principle of tacking, saying, well, maybe that as the seller, maybe we owned it. So you get a general warranty deed from one part and you get a quitclaim deed for the other saying, we think we have an interest, we don't know, here you go. And then what they did, what that party did, at their attorney's instruction, they went to their brand new neighbors and said, here's a quitclaim deed, we need you to sign a release for this 8-foot strip wide piece of property that we actually own, you don't. That kind of ended their, budding relationship right at the very beginning. And it ended up in court, went all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court. And the defendants who said, look, that can't be your property, or maybe they were the plaintiffs actually in this case, whichever, and they basically made the following arguments, 2 arguments. One, they said, it couldn't have been a hostile situation because nobody knew that was even going on. It was just an accidental surveying mistake. Nobody knew, therefore it couldn't really be hostile. 2, Your Honor, they know they don't own the property, they asked us to sign a quitclaim deed. So who are we kidding here? And the Illinois Supreme Court said, well, hostile has nothing to do with whether it was known or not. Part of the idea here is, again, if you don't use your property, you lose it. If you don't use it enough and somebody else uses it for 20 years in Illinois, it's theirs. That's just the way that the law works. So the ignorance was a non-issue. And as far as here's a quitclaim deed, please sign this so we can now own this 8-foot strip of property, the court said that was a formality, but that title transferred after 20 years. It just wasn't recorded. So there was no argument at all for the people who lost a strip of land if the transfer had happened 20 years in. And after 20 years, what happens is the statute of limitations is you no longer have the right to defend your interest in the property. So the lawsuit to say, no, that's ours, just doesn't do anything because the title transferred after 20 years and it's not yours anymore. So adverse possession is alive and well in Illinois and in every other state. I got another class I've taught, I used a case in Missouri, I think it was, or Mississippi, where it's 10 years. Same kind of thing. Once it happens, it happens. Still upheld by courts. All right, so one of the lovely things in a class like this we get to do is kind of kill off fake people and then decide where their property goes. Again, I don't know how critical this is for practice. This part of the text is probably as important for you as people as it is as real estate agents. You could get a question at the state exam about, what it means to have a valid will and who's a testator and all that kind of thing. I don't know how important it really is. Again, this is the purview of a estate planning attorney. you can either die testate or intestate. Testate, you have a will. And that will dictates where your stuff goes, assuming it's legal. Right? So, same thing, you have to be at 18 years of age. Needs to be witnessed, and it has to be in writing in some form or fashion. You can, your handwriting, it can be typed, it can be laser printed, it doesn't matter. Some states now are allowing video wills. Illinois doesn't do that yet, I don't believe. So, but once you have a legal will, there it is. It's going to say where your stuff goes. And there's a bunch of terms that I don't really care whether you know, except for probate. And I think we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so if you die intestate, now you don't have a will. So where does your stuff go? Yeah, if you've got it in joint tenancy or tenancy by the entirety, it's going to go that way, right? We already know that from Chapter 8. It'll go based upon that right of survivorship. But everything else, it's based upon this probate act, what's typically referred to as law of descent and distribution, which every state has. And it's pretty straightforward in Illinois, really, but it's still not necessarily what you wanted to do. Just check my slides here again. Yeah, all right, so just talking about this really quickly. For the most part, your property will go in logical fashion if you do not have a will. So if you're married and have no kids, everything goes to your spouse. If you're married with children, half goes to your spouse and the other half gets divided equally amongst your children. That makes logical sense so far, right? If you have children and your spouse is, predeceased you or you're divorced or whatever, then it's all split between your kids. The place here where it gets a little bit funky is if you have an adult who dies owning property and they've got parents who are still alive, and that is that the parents, there's either 2 spots or 0. There's never one share for a parent under the Illinois law of descent and distribution. So let's say you have a person who's maybe in the military and they're killed in action and they own some property and they're not married and they don't have kids and they've got a brother, a sister, a mom, and a dad, 4 shares, right? Pretty easy for that. Brother, sister, and only the mom is left, still have 4 shares. The mom gets 2, the moms and the dads, and the siblings each get their own. No parents, split between the 2 siblings.
So it's always considered as 2 parents.
Yeah, so there's either 2 parents or none under that one odd scenario. I don't know if you'd get a question like that at the state exam, right? But at least you can kind of think logically and say, well, where would I want my property to go? Well, I'd want it to go to my spouse, or my spouse and my kids. So the one odd thing is, well, I don't have kids and I don't have a spouse, my siblings and my parents are treated equally, but the law says you either have no parent or you have 2. So for whatever reason, under that law of descent and distribution.
In the quiz for that, there was a question that kind of broke it down like there was a mother and then a son, and then I actually got this question wrong because I thought it would get split up 50-50.
Yeah, it's 2/3
It's
for
2
her.
to 1/3 because of
Right,
what you were saying.
the mom, the dad, and then the kid, right, yeah,
Okay.
right. And again, if you have a will, none of that matters, because if a legal, valid will. Now, one thing I want to point out, and again, everybody should have a will, so my quick, free, personal advice to you, have a will, and make sure it's valid. If you move to a different state, have your will updated to that state, because it's going to be tested not under the law of the state in which the property is, but under the state in which you live at the time you die. So the process is that wills have to be proven, and this is what probate means. Again, those of you who are Spanish speakers, the word probar means to prove or to test. So this is what we do. We prove or test a will. Within like 30 days of somebody's death, that will needs to be recorded, placed into the public record. So anybody with a claim against the estate will know. Old Luxon, the real estate prof, finally kicked off. Good, he owed me money, I can go and try and get it from the probate court. Mostly every estate in Illinois goes through probate. You can avoid probate by having a well-crafted estate. If you don't own everything, if it's all owned by trusts, you can avoid probate no matter how much stuff you have. It's good estate planning. Again, a good estate planning attorney can help you with that. It also can help you avoid some taxes if you do it that way. Probate is also an opportunity to prove, that the will is valid and see what kind of claims there are. If you have a small estate, and there's no real estate involved, small estate in Illinois now, I think less than 125,000, you can file a small estate affidavit and you avoid probate also. That's usually when one spouse dies and they owned everything jointly and there's really nothing left individually, then you have a small estate. And there's no real estate because the house was owned in tenancy by the entirety or joint tenancy and already transferred immediately upon death, so it doesn't go to the estate itself. Otherwise, again, probate is in front of the court and you can't transfer the property until it gets all the way through probate. If you're not sure if one of the heirs is alive or dead or where they are, they might sit in probate for months or a year because you can't just cut out somebody because you can't find them. You need evidence, if they're alive or dead. And that could be true whether you have a will or don't have a will. The courts don't want to transfer property and then have a claim later.
Okay, what did you say that could help, like if there's property in this trust
Yeah.
that is gonna go out after, let's say, parent dies or
Mhm.
whatever. Okay, what did you say about how you can save taxes?
Oh, well, having something in a trust might also avoid taxes because the property never actually goes into the estate. So,
Does it have to be a certain kind of trust?
I'm not sure. I've been talking to a good estate planning attorney about how that can work. I've seen this done, and I know this is one of those things that I sometimes get confused on or get wrong, so I'll just leave it at that. And some of those laws have changed. The threshold is much higher now. You can die with more money and still not have your estate tax. And there are other tricks that when it comes to that kind of thing, assets oftentimes get written down significantly at the time of death, depending upon what they are, because of a number of clever accounting tactics that the IRS tends to accept. Depends upon what the estate is. Operating businesses, it's really common that they're written down significantly in value. Because if what you inherit is not a controlling interest, and if it's not a publicly traded thing, who are you going to sell it to? So they can write those things down to 10 cents on the dollar for estate purposes to try and avoid estate taxes. But it's also a valid accounting technique. For just straight real estate, like my dad died and I inherited his house, you probably want to inherit it at full value. Because somebody who inherits real estate inherits it at the market value as of the date of death. So you buy your house in 1960 for 25 grand. You live in it until 2010. You die, it goes to your kid, and your kid inherits it. They don't inherit it at your basis of 1960. They inherit it as a market value as the date of death. But that higher market value is used to determine the value of your estate. So long as you're below, what is it now, a $3 million level or whatever, the estate pays no taxes. So if you're below the $3 million, you want real estate to be fully valued, because then if the family sells it and gets 300 grand for it, there's no capital gain if they inherited it at a $300,000 value for the estate, based on the estate tax return to the IRS. But if you're going to get close to that $3 million estate value, you want to find ways to write things down so you avoid that, because estate tax rates are much too high. Yeah, so anyway, that's the whole idea of probate. You can't really do anything until probate proceedings are over. Probate's public record, so if you want to find properties that are being held by the probate court that can't be transferred, that maybe you want to go to the family and offer them some amount of money as soon as they can transfer it. Some investors will maybe chase that stuff down. Every once in a while you'll see a house that looks like it's been empty for a year, grass isn't mowed, isn't taken care of, maybe because the family all lives out of state and it's in probate and they can't do anything with it, they can't sell it. It's a possibility. One last thing about wills in general that I didn't mention that I probably should, and we're not done yet because I got to get chapter 13 up here, but you do not have to leave anything to anybody except your spouse. You cannot write your spouse out of your will unless they agree to it, in Illinois at least anyway. If the spouse chooses to renounce they can renounce your will and claim their fair share, as it probably addresses in the text. But if your spouse agrees to whatever your estate plan is, then that's not a problem. Otherwise, you have no obligation to leave anything to anybody. Well, except for me. You owe me everything. So for whatever that's worth, you know, you can pick and choose who you leave stuff to otherwise. At least that's the case in Illinois. All right, any other questions left over from chapter 12 at all? All right, let's see if we can get through this in about 30 minutes or less. Some of this we've talked about already. So, because we don't have that single piece of paper that I can say, here's proof I'm the owner, we need a system. And that system that helps us with this is public records. And I think every state in the country now has public records. The last one I remember, Indiana did not, maybe as recently as 15 years ago. It's difficult, much more difficult at that time to figure out who owned what and what things sold for. Harder to do work in Indiana at that time. That's not been the case now for a while. But. So, for us around here, it's normally the county recorder of deeds. If you wonder what does Sandy Wegman do, who's the Kane County recorder of deeds? Well, she records documents and oversees that office that has these public records. That's what she does. One of those people you vote for every 4 years, and you go, what the hell does this one do? Smaller counties like downstate, county clerk does the same function. So when you record something, they either use like a time clock kind of thing, or they just stamp it in for chunk and you get that date and time, or they'll use something fancy like a barcode reader. Take a look at the deeds that I left you with. Let's look at the very first one again. Upper right-hand corner, this is addressed in the textbook about that you're supposed to have a certain size blank space in the document you record. There it is, the blank space. Look at the next one. Upper right-hand corner, the blank space isn't blank anymore, is it? And then look at the last one, which we haven't looked at all yet. Right, barcode. So this one, the second one in the middle here is a timestamp. This was older. You see it was stamped in November of 1997. And then the next one was stamped in 2003 with the barcode. Both of these are DuPage County, the same recorder's office. You can see that somewhere in that 5.5-year timeline, the technology changed. So why is there nothing in this very first one? Why is that still blank?
Because it hasn't been recorded.
Correct. So what Ken said is it hasn't been recorded yet, which is right. So this copy of the very first one is my copy that I received at the, is a copy of what I received at the closing before it was recorded. These other two, I went to DuPage County and pulled out records on properties that I knew something about. The last one is my current residence, that you have the survey for, and this one in the middle is a property that was owned by a real estate development company that I still manage the remnants of today. Hence the copies of recorded documents. So that's what we talked about, that first in time, first in right, recorded right down to the minute. There it is on the document itself. So it's clear on its face when that was done, because that establishes the priority. Now I talked a little bit earlier about giving notice, so let's talk in detail specifically about the kind of notice we're talking about. There's two types of legal notice to give. One is actual notice, and one is constructive notice. And one is just as good as the other, but they are different mechanically. So let me give you the example of this class, to give you an example in this class as an example of what I'm talking about here. So let's pretend, this is all pretend, so for those of you who are half asleep, please recognize this is not a warning notice. So let's pretend that I were to say to you tonight in class that the final exam is going to be held in a different room at a different time. Everybody's here, I give you actual notice. And if you fail to show up, too damn bad, right? Because I gave you actual notice. Constructive notice instead would be something like this. So let's say that on the first night when I walk you through that course shell, which some of you have used and some of you have not ever used, and if I had said to you that first night, by the way, if there are any changes in the class meeting times, they will be posted inside this course shell.
you should check this every week or every day, right? And then I post in there without ever saying another word to you that the final exam is being held in a different room at a different time, and you fail to show up, you might be thoroughly annoyed because you might want to say, I didn't know, I never looked at that thing, I never understood the purpose of it in the first place. And I would say, too damn bad. I gave you constructive notice. Whether you chose to look it up or not is your business. And that's what happens in the public record. So if you buy a piece of property encumbered by an easement and you don't know, you've been given constructive notice. If you buy a piece of property that's encumbered by absurd but legal conditions, covenants, and restrictions, who do you complain to later? Nobody. Because the answer is it's too damn bad. Because you were given notice even though nobody waved it in front of your face, nobody stood up in front of you and told you. So the public records serve as constructive notice. Whatever's in the public record is something you know or could know, and that's good enough. So you buy a property and you don't know about other liens or other encumbrances or other problems, but they're in the public record, you should have known. That's what the public records are all about. It's a very convenient, simple, and easy way to give notice to the world of someone's interest in the real estate. I have a deed, I take the deed and record it. Everybody on the planet, according to US law, now has the ability to know that I'm claiming I'm the owner. And if they then buy that property from somebody on a street corner somewhere, too damn bad, because I have a deed, I'm occupied, and it's recorded. Right? Because we don't have that single piece of paper, so that's how that whole thing works. So it's very important to understand how that constructive notice functions and what it does for us. You know all about priority, first in time, first in right? That first come, first served stuff we talked about in chapter 10 with liens. This is where it actually shows up and functions. This is just a follow-up of the same kind of thing in these public records. You can have other documents shown there. You can have your subordination agreements that we talked about a little bit between the lenders, where I don't need to be in first place. I'll be happy to trade places, whatever. You can have switches in priorities. You can have those things we talked about with unrecorded documents for the property taxes, the secret mechanics lien example we went over at the end of chapter 10, right? So you can have unrecorded things. Don't forget, you lose sight of that. But still, it's these public records mostly that determine what is what and where everything is. You can go back and search these to the beginning of the United States. It's a great way to do family ancestry research for anybody who's interested. If your family were property owners here before, you can find every deed back to the original grant from the U.S. government, from William Penn, from the whatever. It's all there. They never get rid of it. They just take the really old stuff, it's not been computerized, and they put it in an archive room somewhere, but you can go there. And you don't need to prove you're the property owner, you don't need to prove that you ever were, you don't need to prove that you even live in that county. You could live in Uzbekistan, and you get on a flight and you come here and you're here on a tourist visa. You can walk into the Kane County Recorder of Deeds office, and you can say, I want to see every piece of property owned by a guy with the last name Luxon. They will help you find that. And you can look that up, and you can make copies, and you can take them home, and you can show it to all your friends in Uzbekistan. Perfectly doable. In fact, you can do it all online today. This stuff is all searchable online for free. If you have it printed at the Recorder of Deeds office, you might pay something per copy, maybe as much as $1 a sheet. But you can download the stuff and print it online. You can print it on your own printer and download it online today, I think pretty much for no cost. It's a great way to do searches. So for those of you who are going to look at foreclosed property and you're trying to figure out, all right, if there's not going to be any title insurance, if I'm buying this through a court-ordered sale, which lien holder is foreclosing, how do you figure that out? You do a title search, basically. So you can do that on your own. Go ahead.
The question I have is this constructive notice that's given, and if there's anything, any type of encumbrances on there, wouldn't that be found in the title search by the title company?
Yes, assuming you have that. So keep in mind, you don't always have title insurance. If you buy a property at a foreclosure sale, there is no title insurance given to you by the court. You would need to have arranged for that separately and have done the title search before you ever bid.
And then, would it also be fair to say that the constructive notice be an indirect notice?
I guess, I mean, what all I can tell you is that legally it's the same as actual notice, right?
Okay.
Because it's one of those cases where you knew or should have known. And I don't know what the significance of the term indirect is, if that's, kind of a term they use in the text, that would make sense. But I think
Well, it's just my own taking of
Yeah,
it, because
yeah.
it's like, all right, it's over here in a file,
Right,
but it's not directly given to me, like you gave the direct notice.
yeah,
that-
right. I guess, yeah, if you want to look at it that way, just keep in mind that it has the same force and effect
Right.
as if it were given to you directly. That's the real issue. Let's see, what else did I mention about recording? Oh, if I haven't mentioned this before, I'll mention this now. We never unrecord anything. Nothing is ever unrecorded. Once it's placed into the public document, public record, unless a court orders documents to be sealed or removed, it's there permanently. So lender A, who loans money on a piece of property in the year 1900, files a lien on that property. It goes into the public record against that parcel, against that address. In 1910, when those people refinance, that original lien stays there. So when you refinance, two things happen. No change in ownership in this example. Two things happen. A satisfaction of mortgage, which we'll talk about in a later chapter, gets recorded, and a brand new mortgage lien gets recorded. Those two things get recorded kind of, if you will, on top of the original mortgage lien. So when you do a title search, you look in the file. Oh, this was encumbered in 1900. Oh, it was paid off in 1910. Oh, it was re-encumbered right after that again. Right? It's a sequence of what came first. So when we're looking at the title search, we're saying, oh, look, Christina owns this house. Oh, look, Christina sold the house to Steve. Oh, look, Steve sold the house to Cecilia. Oh, look, Cecilia sold the house to Dave and Monica. So you've got this transition, but we don't ever take those old deeds out of the records. They're always there. They just get recorded over by something new. So when you search the public record and you're looking for things like chain of title, this is what you find. The full record of the property's ownership back to the original land grants from whomever that might have been, the Virginia company or whatever. All right. So title searchers really were kind of born in Chicago. Chicago Title and Trust is the big title insurance company, at least in the United States. And these guys were a bunch of abstractors. They were a bunch of title searchers. And in those days, they had what's called their own title plant. They kept all their own records. And so anybody who wanted to do a title search, who owns what property, would have to go to Chicago Title because they had the most records. And in fact, to protect their business at one point in time, they refused to share the information. And some court case forced them to open it up to other people. And many of the title companies still maintain their own title plant, even though all these records should also be available for you at the counties. So the idea of what an abstractor does is to do title searches. Look at the public record and see if we can find the chain of title. And this term chain of title is great if you think of a chain link. Right? If you think of a chain and think of the links, and each link is an owner. And the connection of each one of those chains, that's a transfer point. So you have owner A, and then you have the next link in owner B, and the next link is owner C, and the next link is owner D, etc. So as you look down this chain, each one of those intersections represents a transfer from A to B, from B to C, from C to D. And what you're looking for is to make sure that within whatever period of time you're looking, however far back you're going, that there's not a broken link in that chain. Hang on, how did we get from C to E? How did the property get from there to there? Because that could be a telltale sign of fraud or forgery or something else that could invalidate the title. Now today we don't search back to the original land grants. What is it, 40 years or 65 years in the case of lawsuits?
Because, the state of Illinois said, well, that's ridiculous, who the heck's gonna make a claim from a century ago? We're not trying to do that, we just want it to be like current living adult years, right? I mean, the odds are, if you own a piece of property, 40 years later, you may not even be around to be able to pay something off or deal with it or whatever. And in the case of litigation, 65 years for sure, nobody's gonna, should hold you responsible. That's the idea of these marketable title statutes. Otherwise, you used to be able to just search, you used to search back forever. And computer records only go back for a few decades anyway, they don't go back forever. Anyway, so we search that chain, we're looking for the liens and the releases, we're looking for the transfers and making sure that they're all there okay. And if all that looks good, then the title company should be willing to issue a title insurance policy. Basically, they're going to get paid a fee like any insurance company to ensure the transition from the current grantor to the current grantee, guaranteeing that the grantee is going to get good title. Remember all those warranties and covenants we talked about under the general warranty deed? Who do you want to sue? The driver who rear-ended you, who may not have any money, or their insurance company? Insurance company. Who do you want to sue here? The grantor who promised you could sue them for damages, or they remove something, or the title insurance company? Better to go to the title insurance company and let them solve your problem, and if they believe that they have a claim against the previous grantor, they will pursue it, and you will let them do it, right? And if they make money at it, you don't care. Their job is to just make you whole as the grantee. So that's what title insurance is really all about. So the abstractor, whether that's you, or whether you hire a title searcher, or whether the title insurance company is paying them to do this, just does that complete title research to make sure that ultimately what you've got is marketable title or merchantable title. Technically, legally, those are two slightly different things, but for our purposes, you may consider them synonymous. Marketable or merchantable title. Because ultimately, what does every buyer of real estate eventually want to do? Sell that property, right? So you need to know that whatever I'm buying today, I can sell at some time in the future. I one time through an odd real estate transaction had a seller who was refusing to convey what I consider to be marketable title. And I did not have an attorney. And I looked across the table to his attorney whom I knew, and I said, I'm not closing unless you provide me title insurance that works like this. Talked about the contract. I said, because I don't think I'm getting marketable title. He and his client conferred, and they came back, and they agreed to do it. They knew the right words, I knew the right phrase, and that seemed to work out okay. I don't remember what the particulars were, but they were going to give me something that was less. It was a sale from a land contract. And so it was going to be something less than marketable title, I thought. Anyway, no serious title defects of any kind, very little risk of any problem with the title. That's the whole idea of marketable title. You can sell it to somebody else in the future. Questions about any of this at all? Ultimately, that's where you're trying to go. So, there are a number of different ways to prove ownership. We talked about a deed. It's an evidence of title, but it is not proof. If you go to court and they say you got to post $250,000 bond, and you say, I'll put up title to my house, and you bring in the deed, what's the judge going to say? That is insufficient proof for the purposes of the court. We want something like your most recent title insurance policy. That's better evidence. Because a certificate of title or an abstract with an attorney's opinion letter, or better yet, title insurance, is evidence that some third party has been paid some money to review the title documents and say, yes, in fact, we believe it's good. Otherwise, all a deed really is a promise from me to you that I own the property and here you go. And no court really knows what that means. I run across this as I do leasing at the property that I manage in Aurora here, because the state, which has been a long-term tenant, every time they renew, they insist on evidence of title. And one of the things we provide them is we just provide them with our most recent title insurance policy, and that satisfies them. No deed, nothing else. And even though we've renewed with them a number of times over the last 20-some years,
on 2 different leases, we always have to provide them with that updated title insurance policy. If I can't find it, I can just have a new abstract done for $500 and send them a copy of that. Under the title insurance, there's money paid, right? It's an insurance policy. It's a insurance regulated industry in the state of Illinois, in all states, and insurance tends to be state, not federally regulated. Title insurance is no exception. A premium is paid for this service. Title insurance premiums are paid once at the real estate closing. They are not paid monthly, weekly, quarterly, annually. They're paid once at the closing. 2 sides to the policies. I'll come back to subrogation coverage in a minute. So 2 types of policies. The owner's policy, which covers the transition from the seller to the buyer, and a lender's policy, which covers the lender's interest, which is actually worth more money, right? Because who puts up most of the money in the typical deal? The lender does, not the buyer. So the owner's policy is paid for once and is never paid for again until there's a sale or a new owner. The lender's policy may need to be redone every time there's a new loan. So if you refinance, you may need a new lender's policy, unless you stay with the same lender or they just waive it, which I don't think they would do unless they're the same lender. Okay?
So the owner's policy is paid once.
Right.
And
The seller pays for it and it covers the buyer. So all those promises we talked about, those, deed guarantees, etc. That's kind of backed up by the seller's policy, the owner's policy, which it gives the buyer the right to go to the title company and say, hey, there's a problem with the title. The lender gets a lender's policy, which is usually paid for by the buyer, which covers the lender's interest, which is, as we'll talk about in a later chapter, the mortgage lien, basically. And that has, every time you refinance the property, you'll not have to change the owner's policy, but you will have to get a new lender's policy for the new lender. Steve?
When you talked about leasing to the state, they wanted you to provide a title insurance.
Yeah.
Was it the same guy paying each time?
In a couple of cases, yes. But since we had to refinance about every 3 to 5 years, oftentimes there was a new policy. Or I could get a new certificate, I could call the title company and get something new or whatever. I haven't had to submit anything like that in about 8 or 9 years. But yeah, it was the same basic thing because we've had the same lender now for 13 or 14 years. So I think in one of those iterations with a 5-year lease, we were able to provide them literally the same document, or maybe we had to get an update, I don't remember. And in that case, it's actually submitted, the state does public bidding for their leases. They don't read them aloud like they would for a construction contract, but you have to submit everything and then they look at it. If they have questions with your proof, they'll usually give you a chance to correct it, update it, modify it, something like that. Subrogation is that typical insurance case where you waive your rights. So, when that uninsured motorist hits you and the insurance company pays you, you subrogate your rights and the insurance company gets the right to go after that. If the insurance company collects more money, you don't get a piece of it. You get what you get, and then they take it after that. Same thing is true with title insurance. Once you subrogate to the title insurance company, it's their claim against the other party, not yours. Coverage is just that. It's just coverage. So with title insurance, the idea of coverage is there's either a standard policy or an extended policy, and I'm not sure what most lenders require. I would typically think extended coverage is better. And the textbook, I think, has a little chart or diagram for this. I don't think you need to know about that too much. You should know that there is a set of exemptions on a policy, and that is that, so here's the title insurance, here's what we're covering, and then here's this long list of stuff we're not going to cover. And that will include things like encumbrances caused by the buyer or the seller. So if the buyer or seller create a mechanics lien, for example, through work that's done during the inspection or something like that, the title company is going to say, that's not our problem. So even if the title company pays off the buyer, that means they're still going to go after the seller, or whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of exemptions to the coverage. Ultimately, your title policy will probably have to get blessed by your lender, but if you're buying as a cash buyer, there's nobody else looking that over but you and your attorney. So again, as a cash buyer, you don't have an attorney. you don't have a lender looking at your title policy, and you don't have an attorney looking at your title policy, you better know something about title insurance, or you don't even know what you're getting. I think that's pretty much it for this. Biggest things to understand about, public records, title insurance, etc. We don't record because we have to. There's no law requiring we record. We record because it's a good idea. It's the way we give notice to the world of our interest in the real estate. It's how we protect ourselves against the claims of other people, whether it's other lien holders or other buyers, potential buyers. You don't have to record a deed. There's no law that says your deed has to be recorded. You do it because the lender obligates you to do it, or because it's just a good idea. So it's one of these crazy questions they have at the back of the chapter, right? So let's assume you have no lender requiring you to record the deed to protect not only your but their interest. And you purchase a piece of property and you never record the deed, and then that crazy person who sold it to you sells it to somebody else again and they do record their deed. Now you're in a weaker position. And this is the kinds of questions that sometimes you get at the state exam is, well, who's going to win that claim? Well, there's two ways to give notice, right? Not just actual and construction, but actual and constructive, but there's one is to record and the other is to occupy. So if you purchase a property, never record the deed and never occupy, and a year later somebody else buys that piece of property from the same alleged seller and then records the deed and occupies, they're going to win in court on both counts, and you're going to be the one crying to the title company saying, you got to make me whole because I don't have anything. If you have no title insurance, your only claim is to run after that fraudulent seller who resold your property. So again, you record because you want to. It protects your interest. And remember, it's conveyance of the deed and delivery and acceptance, not recording, that causes the title transfer. Questions about anything out of chapter 13 or really anything at all from tonight? All right, then one bit of caution. For those of you who have not yet read chapter 14, that's usually, for some people, the worst chapter in the text. It's just the driest, the least interesting. So make sure you read as much of that, if not all of it, before you come to class on Thursday night. Also, we'll spend about 20 to 30 minutes talking about the state exam and what that's like. So if you have any questions about what to expect of the state exam, that's a perfect night to bring those in and ask them. Just kind of give you a heads up of, rough idea of what all that's like from my experience from eons ago. And otherwise, we'll just be covering license law and everything else that's in chapter 14. A great couple of days. Try and stay warm. I'll see you back here Thursday night.